morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Ideas Mean Business webinar. I'm Siobhan Smith, Lead for Diversity and Inclusion at KTN, and it's my honour to introduce our host for today's webinar, Claudine Adeyemi. Claudine is an award-winning lawyer and entrepreneur. In 2014, Claudine founded the Student Development Company, a non-profit organisation providing career-related support to young people from less privileged backgrounds. The SDC supported over 1,000 young people. More recently, Claudine founded Career Ear, a site empowering people to make informed career choices. The platform features the UK's first Q&A careers advice service, allowing career seekers to ask career-related questions to industry professionals directly. Claudine now runs Career Ear part-time and works as a lawyer for an ag-tech startup called WeFarm part-time. Claudine has been recognised as a rising star in We Are the City Awards, Brummel's magazine 30 Ones to Watch, and in May 2018, Claudine was listed as EM Power's #1 future leader as presented by the Financial Times. We're delighted to welcome Claudine to share her knowledge of the legalities of running a small business. So over to you, Claudine.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for having me this morning. Good morning, everyone. Conscious that you're all on mute, so it's not like a normal event where I'm going to get awesome responses from you, but good morning. Lovely to be here. I am going to get started and introduce myself. I can't currently see the chat so on, but let me know if there are questions that come through as we go. So just kind of introducing today. So legalities of running a small business. As Siobhan mentioned, I am a lawyer by training. I trained and practiced at a top law firm in the city. Was there for 7 or 8 years, and I then took a break to launch my own startup. So I am in a similar position to you guys in terms of being a first-time founder. Set up my own business, currently still run my own business, and have had experience running a couple of different businesses as well. And I very recently, so back in April, went back into law. So I practice as a lawyer part-time and then run my business part-time. So got my feet in both spheres there, and definitely can kind of speak to the legalities of running a business with my legal hat on, but also as a founder and as someone that has to find the time to actually run a business as well. So getting started, for us today, the key learning outcomes are really going to be to cover some of the basics. So we don't have very long today. Really want to go over some of the basics around company law, thinking about contracts and thinking about intellectual property. We will go through and identify a number of top tips and tricks and just things that you can kind of do for yourself without having to spend thousands and thousands of pounds on legal fees, because it can get quite expensive. And then ultimately really just want you guys to feel a lot more confident and comfortable with understanding how the law interacts with your business, when you might need external support, but having access to the information and resources to be able to do some of that for yourself. Hope that all makes sense. With my legal hat on, one of the things that I do have to say today is that I can't give specific legal advice. So if you have a very specific challenge, I can't advise you legally in this session today. More than happy to kind of answer questions that relate to legal issues and things like that, or concerns that you might have, but can't specifically give one-to-one advice. So sorry about that. And also don't be too put off by my background. I thought I'd get into my kind of legal character, but you're not going to be expected to sit down and start becoming a lawyer and reading all sorts of books. So don't worry about that. So getting started, really want to start with thinking about what a company actually is. So going back to basics, we know that a company is essentially a legal entity, and that legal entity is formed by a group of individuals to engage in and operate a business. Could also be one individual actually, who is both a director and a shareholder, but effectively what the key part is that you're talking about a separate entity to those individuals who are running that business. So thinking about what that means for a limited company, which is what the majority of you, I'd imagine, would be setting up as. All a limited company is and means is that that separate legal entity is very separate to you as an individual, and the individuals who are running that business are responsible for the debts only to the amount of money that they put in at the very beginning. So if you are a owner of a company, you set up a company, usually what you do is you issue yourself shares in that company. There will be a value attached to those shares. Often when you start, you maybe say issue 100 shares, maybe at £1 per share, but it's up to you. You could issue them for 1p per share. And your liability in relation to that company's debts is only going to be up to the maximum of that amount. So what it's doing is it's creating that separation between you as an individual and that company. So if you get to a point, for example, where you own a house or you have all these assets that you own personally, if something happens to your company, you are not going to be having to necessarily put up your house to pay for the debts or sell your belongings to pay for the company's debts, because the buck stops with the company. Sole trader is something that we should cover because many of you, if you haven't started a company yet, may be in this position where you are operating as a sole trader. So sole trader just means that you as an individual are carrying on a business and you have, complete control over that business's operations, but you essentially are the business. What typically happens is that as a sole trader, you will trade as, and then you kind of have your branded company name. So my business is called Career Ear. If I wasn't a company, I could be Claudine Adiemi trading as Career Ear. But to all intents and purposes, from a legal perspective, if someone wants to, for example, hopefully not, but for example, sue Career Ear, they would be suing me because there is no company there that separates me from Career Ear. Hope that makes sense. So just kind of delving into a little bit more detail on those differences. So with a limited company, as I said, you're a separate legal entity. That company can hold different assets. You have limited liability for your members or your shareholders. It's typically easier to obtain funding or raise finance if you think about if you are trying to raise investment from angel investors or from venture capital companies, or if you're going to a bank. Typically, you'll find that a lot easier if you are a registered legal entity. And you often can find that you get better protection for your business's name. So because you are a registered company and that name is registered at Companies House, it makes it a little bit more difficult for another company to launch with the same name, because they're going to have some difficulties there registering their business name. In comparison with the sole trader, usually it's a lot cheaper to get started, because you don't need to think about registering a company, you don't need to think about regulations and reporting and filing things and that kind of thing, because as a sole trader, you're kind of just running as you. Separate point is that obviously you still have to deal with HMRC, so there are still some kind of reporting and filings required, but in terms of as opposed to a company and the reporting from that perspective, there are little to no startup costs on that side, and as a result of that kind of thing, low administrative costs. You can also have a very flexible structure because you're not kind of having to think about your directors versus your shareholders and so on, because you are the business, and you can kind of have complete control over that. Thinking about the limited company then, so I'm going to make an assumption that the majority of you, even if you are not yet a limited company, that's probably the direction that you will be going in if you're looking at setting up your small business and protecting yourself as you kind of run that business. So within a company, you obviously have your directors and you have your shareholders. So your directors, they manage the business on the day-to-day, making sure that the company is compliant with what's called the Companies Act 2006. So complying with all the kind of legal obligations. They really have a duty to make sure that the company is serving the interests of their shareholders, and the shareholders are the owners of that company. So they have shares in that company. Maybe they've invested, maybe you are a director and a shareholder, so you own the company as well as run it on a day-to-day, and those shareholders are responsible for some of the most key decisions. So some decisions a director in the day-to-day of running a business can make and by themselves, but for some of them, such as if you're changing the name of the company, for example, you have to get approval from the shareholders. So this distinction of directors and shareholders tends to not be too much of an issue at the very beginning, where you and maybe some of your co-founders may all be directors and shareholders, and so it will feel as though all the decisions you're kind of making, you're making amongst yourselves. But it gets really important where you either have directors that come in that aren't also shareholders, and equally shareholders who come in that aren't necessarily directors. So a good example, for example, on that front is if you have investors that put some money into your business in exchange for shares, they may not then also require the need to be a director. And so you're in a position then where you've then got people that you have to think about as you make decisions in your business, and making sure that you're running that company to make sure they benefit as owners of that company. And there becomes a greater distinction between the responsibilities of directors and shareholders. The Articles of Association, it sounds a little bit technical if you haven't come across it before, but it's basically just a rule book of your company. You cannot legally form a company without a set of Articles of Association, and it has a whole range of different criteria and different rules, from how you meet through to the ways that you can kind of issue new shares in your company. So it basically just sets out all the rules that relate to your company. The good news is that the government has what's called model articles. So there's a set of articles that for most companies they work, and you can just adopt those. You don't have to go thinking about drafting those from scratch or getting a lawyer to draft those from scratch. But as you grow, you'll need to kind of make sure that you're thinking about your Articles of Association and making sure they work for you. So for example, if we look at this example, so the Real Jet UK Limited, real company, but I've kind of played around with what their Articles of Association might say. So if we think about the fact that their Articles of Association say that, so they have 4 directors and 30 shareholders, and their Articles of Association say that every board meeting must have a quorum of 4. So just touching on that particular point, a quorum is the minimum number of people that have to attend that board meeting in order for a decision to be made. And board meetings are for directors. So at a board meeting, you will pass what's called resolutions, which are basically just the decisions that have been made and agreed by all the directors. In this circumstance, if your articles say you have to have a quorum of 4, it means that you literally cannot have a board meeting unless every single director is present. That is usually in practice unachievable and not particularly sustainable. What you probably want to have if you've got 4 directors is maybe having a quorum of 2, maybe 3. So that's that's a good example of why your Articles of Association are really important. The second example that's on the screen there is articles say that the general meetings must have a quorum of at least 50. The general meetings are the meetings for shareholders. So as I said, sometimes you need a meeting with shareholders to make certain decisions. If the quorum has to be at least 50%, it means that you're requiring at least 15 shareholders to be present before a decision can actually even be made, which isn't too bad. So just thinking about incorporating your company then, some of the things to think about. So is your company name even available? So if you look in the tips section, I've included the link to which you can check on Companies House whether a company name is actually available. It's obviously completely free to do as well. And then sometimes people also forget about the trademark side of things. So often if you are registering a company name, that's the same name that you want to run your business in. And so you also want to think about whether you are going to be able to protect that company name with a trademark. It may be that you have a completely different company name to the name that is on your website and that people know you by. That's absolutely fine, but it's just worth thinking about whether the trademark that you want would also be available if that's going to affect the company name that you register. Do you have an address? You can't register a company without an address. You have a registered office address for your company, and then as directors you also need to have an address. you are absolutely free to use your home address. However, you just need to be mindful for the fact that that will be publicly searchable. So anyone looking at your company name will be able to see your address details. If you're not comfortable with, which most people aren't, with your home address being available online, then you want to think about getting a registered office address. And then, as I mentioned, looking at those model articles and just checking that those work for you. Incorporating a company is pretty straightforward. You can do so online and just pay a fee of £12 if you're adopting those model articles, and your company will set up in 24 hours. So pretty straightforward from that perspective. If you don't want the model articles, it's a little bit more complicated, but I've included some information within this deck that will help you with navigating that. I'm just going to see if I can see the chat just to check whether there are any questions. So let me just open that up. Siobhan, I can't see.
That's fine, Claudine. I'll read some of them out. So
Okay.
yeah, Emily has asked, are all registered companies incorporated? So a registered limited company would technically be whatever the company name is, limited, incorporated.
Yes, so incorporating your company just means registering. So you're registering that, you're applying to Companies House to set up that company, and that is the process of incorporating. So yeah, to answer that question.
And then Santos asked, if we don't want to use our home address, what is other cheap options?
Yeah, so there's I guess a couple of different things that you can think about. So if you have, say, a set of accountants that you use, it may be that they are happy to for you to use their registered office as your registered office. There are a number of different companies that operate as virtual office spaces. So what they do effectively is sell you an address. And you can use that address for your registered office. Post from Companies House, HMRC, and indeed normal post can also be delivered to that address, and they can then forward it on to you or scan it over to you and things like that. Or it may be that you're able to access some kind of office space, maybe a co-working space, and you can have a conversation with them about whether you can use their address for your registered office. So for us, we've got some offices in South London, and we use that office address for our registered office address, if that makes sense. But when you're just starting out, and which is what we did, we used a virtual office address from one of these companies online. Some of them are relatively cheap. I think you can kind of get them for £75 for the year. But yeah, they do go up as well. So it depends. And you can also get a variety. So if you're, for example, not in London, they typically end up being much cheaper. So hopefully that helps. Any other questions just on the company side, Siobhan?
So we've got one that says, can a quorum meeting be accepting attendance if the meeting is held remotely?
Yes, absolutely. And I didn't want to kind of go into too much detail, just conscious of time, but often you don't have physical meetings anyway. So yeah, especially in the climate that we're in now, many of those meetings take place virtually, but also it could just be, for example, that say you've got two directors, yourself and your co-founder, you're having a conversation, you decide between you that you're going to make some kind of decision. You record that decision ideally, and that can kind of form that's a valid way of making company decisions. So yeah, I wouldn't get too stressed about that, but it's certainly important as you continue to grow.
Okay, so I've got 3 last questions for you. Can you change the shares of the shareholders, and how can you do that if you can?
Yep. So that's a little bit of a complex question because my answer would be it depends. But you can transfer shares, shareholders can sell their shares subject to what the articles say. You can issue new shares as a company, which has the impact of diluting the value of the existing shares. So if you've got 100 shares in issue and they're all worth £10 each, obviously if you then issue another 100 shares, there's 200 shares available, and so those shares won't be worth £10 each anymore. They'll be worth, I think, if my maths is correct, £5 each. And so there are different ways of structuring that, but it does get a little bit more complicated. I'm conscious of time, Siobhan, so should I just jump to the next phase and then we can kind of pick up other Q&A
One
at
more
the end?
question and then we'll jump to the next one. So Charlotte wants to know, what are the disadvantages of incorporating your company?
The disadvantages, good question. So disadvantages, probably kind of cost and that kind of regular reporting side. So you do have to kind of stay on top of making sure that you are filing your accounts at the end of each year, which means that you then need to think about preparing those accounts. You also need to provide a confirmation statement every year, which is basically confirming who the owners are in the company, that kind of thing. But a lot of that from my perspective is relatively low on the admin side, particularly when you're just starting out. There are the kind of fees as well. So I think the confirmation statement, you have to pay a £13 fee every year, but to file your accounts you don't, but obviously you then may incur costs with an accountant preparing those. But frankly, if you're running any business, if you're not even incorporating your company, you should still be preparing your accounts and things like that. So yeah, those costs are largely unavoidable.
Perfect. So I'll let you continue and we'll pick up some more questions later on.
Awesome. So delving into contracts then. So what is a contract? So at its bare minimum, a contract is an agreement between two or more parties. So those could be individuals, those could be companies, and that contract gives rise to mutual obligations. So things that both sides have to do to perform that contract, and those are legally enforceable. So what do you need for a legal contract? You need an offer and acceptance. So someone making an offer and the other party accepting that offer, that creates that agreement. Consider what's called consideration, which is usually money exchanging hands in exchange for a good, so a product, a service, or some kind of obligation. And then crucially, you also need an intention to create a legal relationship. So I'm going to actually attempt again to access the chat because I would love to know what your thoughts are on these three scenarios. So have a read of the three scenarios on the screen. And I want to know which one you think is a legal contract. So one of these is a legal contract, two of them are not. So have a read and let me know in the chat what your thoughts are. You can just kind of say 1, 2, or 3. I can see the chat now, Siobhan, so I can pick up what people generally think. So you send 100 samples of your product to prospective customer with an invoice requiring payment. Is that the legal contract? An agreement with your housemate to wash the dishes for a week for £50. Is that a legal contract? Agreement to rent a property but paying cash in hand and no tenancy agreement. Is that a legal contract? So let's see. So we've got quite a few 2s, 1, 3, 1, 1, none. Not a trick question. There's definitely one. Middle one. Okay, so mostly everyone is going for 2. So I'm going to start with why it's not 2. So with 2, you've obviously got an offer and acceptance there because you've kind of offered to your housemate that you'll wash the dishes for a week. Housemate's accepted, you've got that agreement, you're going to be paid £50, you've got some consideration there. The piece that is missing with this one is the intention to create legal relationships. So what you're not doing when you have an agreement for something like this is intending for that to be a legal contract. Yeah, you're not expecting to, if you don't get that £50, go off to court and sue your housemate to recover that £50. The reason why it's not number 1 is you don't have the agreement. So you're off your own accord. You're sending 100 samples of your product to a prospective customer. You're sending them an invoice. But they haven't actually accepted. The only time they're going to accept is if they then pay for that product, right? So you don't have that side of things. And that consideration hasn't passed hands yet. So it's number 3, which is I suspect going to be a surprise to many of you, but here you've got an agreement to rent. So the agreement, the offer and acceptance piece is there. You are paying for that to be able to rent that property. It's just that it's cash in hand, but the method of payment doesn't have any impact. You don't have any tenancy agreement in terms of that being, you know, an agreement that you can actually have in writing, but you don't need a contract to be in writing for there to be a contract. And so if you rent a property, you are likely to be in a position where you're intending to have legal rights to be there and occupy that premises. And so that one is actually a legal contract. So the key thing is to make sure that you guys are aware that a contract really does not need to be in writing. And I say that to warn, so that you are not thinking that because you haven't signed anything or you haven't put something in writing that you haven't entered into a contract with someone. So it could still be a contract if it's not in writing. However, disputes arise most often when contracts are not in writing. And so that is why you do tend to have things in writing, so that both parties, or more parties than those two, know where they stand, know what obligations that they need to comply with, know how much they need to pay, when they need to pay, all of those things usually set out in a contract. My top tip, which you can see on the right here, which we're also going to go into, is email as your friend. So in terms of thinking about how you can avoid ridiculous legal fees, and speaking as a lawyer, legal fees can be ridiculous, particularly when you're starting out, is thinking about just making sure that you're recording things by email. So just having that written record where you might have had a conversation with someone, you've agreed to sell them one of your products, say for example, or you've agreed to deliver a particular service. Simple email following up saying, great to chat, this is what we've agreed, this is the timescale, this is what we've agreed on payment, let me know if you disagree. So they've got an opportunity to correct that record of your conversation. And then at least then, if you've got a dispute later on, you've got a way of going back to that email to say, well, no, look, this is what we agreed. That helps massively. So just looking at some of the top tips then, so like I said, email's your friend when you're starting out and you don't have enough money to pay for contracts, particularly when the contract isn't high risk. Take inspiration also from contracts that you receive. So if you are thinking about kind of putting together a basic contract, where again you don't have the funds to be able to get a lawyer involved, or it's not particularly high risk, maybe asking that the side that the other party that you're entering into a contract with to send you a contract, or as you go looking at the contracts that you tend to receive and taking some of those clauses. Obviously do that with caution, because some of those things will be in place for certain reasons, and there's going to be a legal basis for some of those. But generally speaking, you can start kind of thinking about how you can use those examples. Similarly, if you've got a competitor in the market and you need T's and C's for your own website, it could be that you can look at some of their T's and C's to get inspiration for your own. Again, a kind of hacky way to just get started. So you've got something, again, do it with caution. They would have drafted, hopefully, their T's and C's specifically for their business and to work for them. Again, also making sure that you're thinking about whether that competitor is in the UK and their T's and C's are for English law. So yeah, just thinking about some of those things. But again, you can take inspiration from some of those things. I've certainly done it before. T's and C's are terms and conditions, sorry. So if you've got a website, usually you've got your terms and conditions that are associated with the service that you're delivering for your website, or the terms and conditions associated with purchasing a product from you or something like that. And it could be that it sits off a website as well. So it could just be that when you deliver a service, you're then sending an email with your standard terms and conditions. You can have access to, there's a lot of templates going around. Seed Legals is a very popular website for templates. These ones do come obviously at a cost, but Seed Legals aims to make it more affordable for people who are setting up businesses to access the legal documents they need without employing lawyers. And then Ferrilio is another version of Seed Legals as well. And then finally, ask around. I am in a lot of different business communities where people, send messages around saying, has anyone got an example of X, or has anyone got an example of this contract, so that they are, sharing templates amongst themselves, so that you've got access to those for free. So hopefully that is all useful. So jumping into intellectual property, I can't see any other questions in the chat on contracts themselves. I don't know if there's a separate Q&A, Siobhan.
So there is a separate Q&A. We've got one. If you want to lend money, no interest to a limited company, do you need to write a loan agreement or an email stating the agreement can do?
So I'm not sure if that's you as a director of your own company loaning money to your own company, or if you're talking about a kind of separate arm's length transaction. So a company that isn't anything to do with you. I think the starting point is, if you are entering into kind of any types of contract, you should try and have a contract in place, right? So the email is the fallback if you don't have any other way of being able to pay for or draft a contract. So it's just making sure that information is there. There's no overarching regulation that I can think of where you've got a director loaning money to its own business where you need a clear loan agreement in relation to that, or indeed for B2B lending, it's a lot less regulated than if you're lending to consumers. But yeah, generally speaking, you should have some kind of contract in place. If you need to do it by email, that email is acting as your contract, if that makes sense. So I hope that's helpful.
So we've got one more that's relevant to this section. As a startup, where would you recommend that we start with forming our terms and conditions, privacy policy or elsewhere? And would you say Seed Legal is okay for startups?
Yeah, so Seed Legals, I'm pretty sure they have example terms and conditions. But like I said, also looking at and comparing any templates that you have with competitors' T's and C's as well. And I say terms and conditions, that also includes things like privacy policies. With privacy policies, you should also look at the ICO's website, so the Information Commissioner's Office website, where they have lots and lots of guides and resources to make sure that you are complying with the laws around data protection. So obviously I haven't had a chance to cover that in today's session, but data protection is super key, and you have to make sure that you are one compliant, but two, have the right policies in place. So I would definitely advise checking that out so you actually understand what your obligations are before you're just drafting a policy that you don't know how to comply with, if that makes sense.
So there's just one more that might be relevant to this section, and then we'll move on. When you are selling a product or service, does that imply there is a contract in place?
Yes, generally speaking, it's hard to think of so if we go back to this, these 3 steps, if you're selling a product or a service, it's hard to see a version of that where you don't have an offer and acceptance. So if someone's agreed to buy your product or buy your service, you've got that offer and acceptance. If they're buying it, then there's consideration passing because they are giving you money for it. And then you've got that intention to create a legal relationship. So I think it might be different if you maybe if you've got a flower business and you maybe sell some flowers to your grandma, you might not want to create a legal relationship there. And it's about that intention that you have at the time. So it may well be that the way that your family is set up is that you did intend to have that legal relationship. But generally speaking, it's difficult to see a circumstance where if you're selling anything to a third party, you don't have that intention to create a legal relationship. So you would have a contract in that respect. And then if you don't put things in writing, it's then just going to be what you kind of say around that verbally, which is why it's so important to have that in writing.
Perfect. So we'll move on and we'll take some more questions towards the end.
Awesome. Okay, so the final section is intellectual property. So stripping intellectual property all the way back, it's looking at the things that you create using your mind. So that's super vague. So we're going to delve into that in a little bit more detail. So these are some different intellectual property rights that you can have, and we'll go through each of them and where they kind of come into play. So copyright, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of, usually kind of it's a bit technical, but it basically refers to like literary works, which effectively just means things that are kind of written in some way, but that is kind of quite a loose way to describe it. So that could include ebooks. So if you are writing an ebook on behalf of your business, you will have copyright in that. But it could also extend to software code, recording. So if you've got a podcast, you'll have copyright in that podcast. If you write music or code music, you can have copyright in all of those things, right? So that's the areas that copyright applies. With copyright, you get it automatically. So I think there's a massive myth that you need to kind of find some ways to register your copyright. You do not. You automatically generate copyright in any kind of literary work that you produce. So as soon as you produce that ebook, there's copyright in that. If you kind of take something and adapt it, you can generate copyright in that adapted version. So yeah, that's how copyright works. Trademark is the other popular one that you would be thinking about as you're just starting up. Trademarks are around kind of usually kind of associated with your brand. So like your business name, your logos, taglines, sometimes even extending to like the colors within all of that. So yeah, with trademarks, you basically are protecting that kind of brand aspect. You don't necessarily need to register a trademark, but you can do so. If you register your trademark, you obviously get a bit more of a secure protection. There is a cost to registering your trademark. The cost very much varies on what you're trying to register, to be perfectly honest. I think when we did it originally, it was a few £100. But yeah, there is a cost. But I'll go into what to do if you're not actually going to register your trademark separately. With patents, that's kind of more protecting super technical things. So if you've got kind of inventions and formulas that you are kind of creating, and it's kind of your secret sauce and you need to protect it, then you typically would try and apply for a patent. They take a very long time to secure. And they can be very, very expensive to obtain. So you're probably looking at those ones of thousands of pounds. So unless you kind of are, building some kind of deep tech type piece, or kind of in the kind of science realm where you're looking at formulas and thinking about how the formulas that you're using are creating a particular product or something like that, that you need to patent because it's brand new, then that's probably not one that you would need to think about. Design rights relate to kind of the shape of things and the appearance of things. So to give you a good example, we all know the Coca-Cola bottle, right? So they will have design rights in the shape of that Coca-Cola bottle. And so you can register design rights. I'm pretty sure you can have unregistered design rights as well. But again, unless you're kind of creating physical goods from scratch, not one that you necessarily need to think about. And then trade secrets. So trade secrets are, I guess, kind of those secret sources that aren't patentable. So you're thinking about your customer lists, or maybe kind of recipes and things like that, if they got out and someone copied, it would be really damaging to your business. But because you have that knowledge and way of doing that particular thing, or that bit of information, it allows you to kind of have leverage on the rest of your market. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. So just looking at how to protect your IP. So I spoke about trademarks. Obviously, as I said, if you register your trademark, that will afford you much better protection. If you don't register your trademark, that is still okay, and we'll come on to the symbols shortly. With copyright, because you get it automatically and there is no way to register per se, what you need to do is you just assert copyright in something. So you may have seen on most websites at the very bottom, it will say copyright 2020, and it will have this symbol with the C in the middle. That's that organization basically saying, this organization, have copyright in this website and the content within it. And you can do that across the board. So anything you produce that you want to assert copyright in, you can kind of just have that wording at the bottom, your organization, copyright, the year, and that C symbol. And that basically is saying to everyone else in the world, we have copyright in this thing. The other two symbols that I've got here relate to trademarks. So if you haven't got if you've got a registered trademark, the symbol to use is the circle with that R. So that is telling the world that you have a registered trademark in this particular brand or logo or whatever it is. And the TM is what you use if you don't have a registered trademark. So if you haven't gone to the trademark office to register your logo, what you can do is you can add this TM to your logo as a starting point. And that's basically saying to the world, I haven't registered this trademark, but I am asserting trademark rights within this, this logo. So you shouldn't be copying it. And it's best practice also to kind of keep a record of when you started using that logo, and when you added that trademark to it, because it's a little bit complex, but the way that trademark rights work is that if there ever comes a time where there's a dispute, what the court would be looking at or how it would be resolved is trying to understand whether the other party that is using something that's similar to your logo would be confused between the two. And part of that is thinking about how long both of you have been using that particular logo. So if you start using your logo today and in 10 years time, someone else, and you didn't register it, and in 10 years time someone else comes along and is trying to use something that looks very, very similar, you'd be able to say, no mate, I've got a trademark in this, and I've been asserting this for a very long time. Look, you can see our records where we noted that we first started using this logo. You can see at this point where this logo is shown here, way back in 2020, that we started using this. And so it's fair that to expect that people will associate this logo with our business. Hope that will make sense. Another way to protect your IP, is through using non-disclosure agreements. So if you are entering into conversations with third parties and so on, thinking about entering into a non-disclosure agreement where they have they are restricted from being able to share information that they receive from you that is confidential, and that would include information that you have intellectual property rights within. My biggest caveat to that is that non-disclosure agreements are very, very difficult to enforce and can be quite expensive to enforce. So actually the biggest way, the biggest and most obvious and most inexpensive way is just to think about your security and your confidentiality. So as a business, what information is ever necessary to share with anyone. When you're entering into a conversation with, maybe they are going to be a partner, maybe they're going to be a customer, maybe that it's someone that you want to join as an advisor, whatever it is, do you, before they come on board, actually need to give them all of this information? Do you need to provide them with all the details around your intellectual property, particularly thinking about things you have copyright in or trade secrets? Does everyone in your business need to have that information? And just kind of thinking that through so that you have a clear idea of the security measures and confidentiality policies that you will maintain. And really, if you're not sharing that information externally, then there's less chance of people kind of taking your secret source and using it against you or for their own benefit. So yeah, I think that largely covers what I wanted to run through. So hopefully we still have, I think, 50 minutes for Q&A. I've also added a list of different resources, some of which came up during the session today, but others which I haven't really had a chance to go through. So I mentioned the Information Commissioner's Office. There's also, from a GDPR specific perspective, a checklist that you can go through to make sure that you understand how you comply with GDPR. I mentioned Frilio and Seed Legals in terms of template legal documents. The link for the company formation just takes you through step by step as to what you need to do to create a company. The IP website, Intellectual Property Office website, has all sorts of online training in relation to IP. So if you're particularly concerned about IP, I'd definitely check that out. And all their resources are completely free. So really, really handy website to learn more about intellectual property and how you go about protecting your intellectual property and therefore your business. The British Library and IP Centre is one that is often missed. It's based in King's Cross, but they also have resources online as well. Definitely worth having a look at. They run all sorts of kind of webinars and training as well, but also have resources that you can access and learn from. We haven't had a chance to obviously cover anything to do with employment, and when you do get to that stage, if you're not there already, the ACAS website is hands down the best place to go to for looking at resources and your obligations and requirements in relation to that. And then, yeah, just a couple of other sources that I think I've shared already in terms of checking company names and trademarks and staying on top of those filings. So that covers everything. And yeah, happy to kind of run through Q&A. Siobhan, I don't know if it's probably easier because I think there might have been some that were missed earlier. So happy to take those questions.
So I've got quite a few questions for you.
Amazing.
Is there a specific way that company decisions need to be recorded and kept?
So I think my advice would be when you're starting out, I wouldn't stress too much about that. I would just say that you need to think about keeping records that make sense to you. So in a larger company, you have what's called board minutes and board resolutions. So during the course of your board meeting, you would record, the discussion that happens at that board meeting, and then you would create separate board resolutions so that would list like the different decisions that have been made as a result of that. As a company just starting out, frankly, we as early stage founders don't have time for that. And so it's just kind of, it might be that you're kind of recording decisions on email. It might be that you just keep an ongoing Google document open that you can kind of add things to. So it's just being really pragmatic about it. I'm a lawyer and I don't have board resolutions in my startup, if that gives you any comfort. Just be pragmatic about it and just be sensible in terms of your record keeping.
Brilliant. And then I've got one saying, is there a legal requirement to have a board meeting as a limited company?
So your articles will basically dictate when you need to have a board meeting. There's no kind of requirement to have them at a certain level of frequency. But the point is that as directors, if you're making crucial decisions about your business, they should be decisions made in accordance with your articles, which is usually going to be a majority vote.
Perfect. And then somebody stated, I did a trademark check and there is another firm with the same name as mine. They are in another industry. Do I need to change the company name?
In short, not necessarily, but it massively depends. So sorry, that's not clear, but not necessarily, because often what you're doing with trademark is that you are saying this is the asset that I want to register trademark protection in, and this is what I would be using that asset for. And so if they are, I don't know, in agriculture and you are in the entertainment industry, the chances of people who are familiar with either of your businesses getting confused between the two are probably going to be slim. And so there probably won't be an issue with registering it.
Okay, brilliant. Somebody's asked if you will be able to speak a bit more about community interest companies and what their legal obligations might be.
Yep. So community interest companies are kind of a bit of a middle ground between a charity and kind of a normal limited company. At its core, a community interest company is still a limited company. So you'd have to register a limited company. That could be limited by shares or by guarantee. So if you're kind of more on the non-profit side, where you're not envisaging, having to issue shares to new shareholders or investors or things like that, you might want to go down the limited by guarantee route. And then what you do is you're basically layering on top of that you are a community interest company. Community interest companies have requirements whereby your assets are what's called locked. And so largely what that means is that you can't just go off and sell all of your assets unless, basically you're having to basically run that company so that you are reinvesting your profits and your assets back into the community that you are trying to serve. And you can't just give away your assets, because that's then going to have an impact on how you can support the community that you exist to serve. There's also an extra requirement to file what I think is called a CSO1, but basically an extra form that reports to Companies House on the impact that you're having, how you're kind of continuing to serve your community and involve your community in the work that you're doing. So yeah, I hope that's helpful insight.
Thanks, Claudine. And then somebody's asked, is it better to get on board an accountant or a lawyer for creation of contacts?
For contract creation.
Yes.
So if you're looking at creating contracts, it'll be a lawyer. The accountant side will help you with thinking about your finances. So thinking about preparing your accounts, thinking about filing your documents with HMRC. So that's a side that we obviously haven't been able to cover today, but you're going to have to file your tax returns to HMRC every year as well. So your accountant will be able to help with that, but your lawyer will be able to help with creating those contracts for you.
And in terms of HMRC statements, etc., do you get prompts to do these?
Yeah, so you can register on HMRC to receive those kind of notifications. They typically are pretty good, to be honest, with sending you things by post anyway. But I think there's obviously more of a shift to kind of go digital, so you can get email notifications. There is a link at the bottom of my screen right now, informdirect.com. They are really good because once you register with them, they will send you notifications in relation to Companies House stuff as well. So when you need to file your confirmation statement, how long you've got to file your accounts at the end of the year, that kind of thing. So I would go belt and braces, so like register for all of them, because once you get fined, the fines are not pretty. So get all of your notifications so that you're just being prompted left, right and center. That would be my advice.
Brilliant. And is it possible to register your company name so it doesn't get used as a sole trader without being a limited company?
Oh, good question. Not really. So you could still register the trademark. So that would be one way of protecting the name without registering an actual company. You could also, no, you couldn't do that. I was just thinking you could potentially, you say you can have companies that go dormant, but if you're still operating as that company, then you wouldn't be able to be dormant at the same time. So I think the best way would be registering as a trademark, but also like thinking more broadly, right? So having a website that's in that name, having all your social media accounts in that name, and just making sure that you're cementing that name is associated with you. You don't need a company behind you to be able to do those things.
Perfect. So we've also got a question. At what point do you issue shares and how does this work?
It is super complicated. So what I would probably advise is when you get started with setting up your company, issue a range of shares to get started. So when you start your company, in those docs that you file, you're basically saying, this is the number of shares that I am starting my company with. So what I would advise, and this is what I did, start with say 100, even maybe 1,000 shares. And then you will then be in a position where you can just transfer your shares, which is a much easier process than the company issuing new shares, if that makes sense. So if I think about for me, just to give you an example, I started my business by myself, and then I had a co-founder join me. So I started with 100 shares, and then my co-founder joined me and I wanted to give her shares. So rather than going through the whole process of issuing new shares, which also involves filing things at Companies House and preparing new documents and things like that, I entered into just an agreement with her to transfer some of my shares to her. And that was just a much simpler process. When you get to the stage of having external investors join, it's unavoidable. You will have to like issue new shares to those individuals. So you definitely need lawyers at that stage though, because that's almost even a little bit complicated for me. So yeah.
Chad has said, I've been offered to collaborate with and establish potential competitors to get help developing my product. I have previously declined similar offers because their NDAs prevent me from going to market with my product. Is it normal to ask for contracts to be amended?
Yeah, absolutely. It's your business. You need to protect your business and your rights within it. If you're not happy with something, and particularly if in your gut you feel that it's not right, don't do it. And push back. ask for any amendments that you feel are necessary. And actually, when you do ask for those amendments, if you are getting pushback, that's probably going to be a bit telling of the organization that you're trying to work with, if they are kind of, being super restrictive.
And with regards to protecting your knowledge and business secrets, and if a startup company wants to collaborate with another company, how would you go about doing that?
So I think the step one is really thinking about what information is business critical for you, what information goes to the heart and core of your business, and that you wouldn't want shared. And then thinking about the relationship that you're trying to build, or that partnership you're trying to build. Does that information need to be shared with that organization in order for you to perform that partnership? So that's probably the process that I would go through. Excuse me. I would say often you don't need to share everything with everyone that you're entering into a partnership with. So I think going through that process should help. And then when you get to that point, it's then having very, very clear contracts with that organization, so that you both understand what your obligations are, but crucially, what information still belongs to who. If you're working together and producing, so say for example, new content or a new service, who ultimately owns that, and who owns the IP in that. And so just thinking all of that through. I think when you get to that stage, particularly if it's something, so to give you an example, it could be that you are just going to work with another organization and put on an event together. That's relatively low risk, right? If you're going to work with another organization and build an entire service and deliver that service, that's a lot more higher risk. And so at that point, that's when you probably will need to think about getting a lawyer involved to make sure that that contract is fit for purpose, and that you understand your obligations in performing that contract.
Brilliant. So last question before we will draw to a close there. PS has asked, what is a trademark class, e.g. class 25?
So basically, when you register a trademark, so to the point that I was saying, you register for something, there are loads of different classes that cover different types of business. So you could have a class that, I don't remember all of them off the top of my head, but some classes that might cover like financial services or insurance, other classes that might cover using it for marketing and advertising, some classes that will cover software. So basically, when you go to register your trademark, you would then be selecting the classes that are applicable to your business. And then the cost it will depend on the number of classes that you pick for that. You probably want to at least have a conversation with the lawyer before you do that, to make sure that you are covering the classes that are the most relevant to you, and where necessary, changing the specification within each of those classes, because it can get a bit complex.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Claudine. So I'd like to personally thank Claudine again for hosting today's webinar. Hopefully everybody that's joined us has taken some tips and knowledge that can help you guide with running your business. I'd also like to thank everyone that joined us online today. Our last Ideas Me in Business webinar this year will be taking place on the 4th of December. We'll have some guest speakers, time for you to network with each other, and some prizes to give away. The places are limited. Make sure you register early for attendance, and we hope to see you there. If you'd like to keep up to date with all the Young Innovators news and events, please do sign up to our newsletter, follow us on Instagram, visit our program page, or join the LinkedIn group that we have. So once again, I'd like to express a massive thank you to Claudine for hosting a wonderful session today, and to you all for joining us. And we hope to see you next time. Goodbye, everyone.